So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Nice to see you all. Welcome to session 11 of our course about the foremost Therīs of all. It seems that today we are a small group, but maybe more people will come. We will see. So today we are talking about Yasodharā and Bhattacharya. And according to tradition, these are probably the same person. These are two names for the same person. And we'll explore a little bit if that is the case or not. And of course, Yasodharā is a very mysterious figure because she doesn't really appear in any of the early sources, even though she's the Buddha's wife. And so she should be quite famous, but she is really, really difficult to find. In early sources, in later sources, of course, she's very popular. So before we start, as usual, we will chant the Namo Tassa, and feel free to join me if you like to chant along. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sangham Namasami. So I will share my screen as usual and show you what we are doing today. So today we will briefly have a look at the early text, what we can find there about, well, Bhattacharya and about the Buddha's family, if we can find anything there about the Buddha's family. And then we will have a look at Yasodhara's Pali apadāna text, which is a very beautiful apadāna, but of course apadānas are later literature. But this is one of the later texts that really celebrates women's accomplishments. So contrary to many of the other later texts we've seen so far, where the situation is quite difficult for women, in this apadāna, we will see a different point of view, and I think a very beautiful story. And after that, we will have a look at a Chinese text, Bhattacharya story in the Chinese Yasodharā Agama, and compare a little bit how the Chinese sources portray Bhattacharya as opposed to the Pali text. So that's the plan for today. And Yasodharā does not appear in any of the lists of the foremost nuns, because those lists, of course, belong to the early strata of text. But we have Bhattacharya there, and then later tradition identifies Bhattacharya with Yasodharā. So in the Anguttara Nikāya, we have Bhattacharya as the nun who is foremost of the disciples who have attained great insight. So here she has a wisdom quality. In the Yasodharā Agama, Bhattacharya is the foremost of those who have irreversibly attained liberation by faith. So here she has a faith quality, which is obviously very different from the Anguttara Nikāya. And then we have T126, which, as we have seen many times in our course, is of course a somewhat later list. And here actually Yasodhara's name appears. Here she is called Rahula Mata Yasodharā, so Rahula's mother, Yasodharā. And here she is the great bhikkhunī disciple who did good deeds in previous lives and is endowed with great merit. So she has a merit quality, which again is very different from the other two sources. And this already shows us how difficult it is to pin down Yasodhara's character or to trace her in the early text, because all the other nuns we have looked at so far, when we compare the list, then their foremost qualities are actually quite stable across traditions. And so their basic character or their basic major trait, character trait that they are famous for is consistent more or less across traditions. For example, when we looked at Mahapajapati, she was always the one who was ordained the longest with the most seniority. For Kema, it was wisdom. For Upalavana, it was psychic powers. For Patachara, she had this Vinaya quality. Then Kisa Gotami, she always had ascetic qualities. And Bhatta Kundalakesa was always the one who attained arahantship the swiftest, the quickest. But for Bhatta Kachana / Yasodharā, there's really no consistency across traditions. And that already shows us that her tradition, like the idea of her character, doesn't really go back to the earliest strata of text, or there's no consistency there between schools. So there was a lot of variance in her character, and her character really developed over a much longer period of time. And now I will show you what the Buddha himself says in the early sources about his family and about his going forth. So traditionally, we think that, I mean, we all know the story of the Buddha's going forth, where obviously he was married to Yasodharā, and Yasodharā had just given birth to the baby boy, Rahula. And in the middle of the night, the Buddha snuck out and he rode away without saying goodbye to anyone. He rode away on his horse and he crossed the river and then became an ascetic. But that's actually not how the Buddha himself describes his going forth in the early sources. So here, this is the Majjhima Nikaya 26, the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the sutta on the noble search, which is a sutta where the Buddha tells his own biography, so his life story in his own words. And he tells of his decision to go forth and then how he went forth. And there he says, "Mendicants, before my awakening, when I was still unawakened, but intent on awakening, I too, being liable to be reborn, thought what is liable to be reborn, myself liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, I sought what is also liable to these things. Then it occurred to me, why do I, being liable to be reborn, grow old, fall sick, sorrow, die, and become corrupted, seek things that have the same nature? Why don't I seek the unborn, unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted, supreme sanctuary, extinguishment?" So Nibbana. So the Buddha is reflecting, he's still very attached to all these things of samsara, all this suffering. And now he is reflecting that he should actually seek for a solution to the problem and seek for Nibbana. And then he continues, "Some time later, while still black-haired, blessed with youth, in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise, weeping with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, dressed in ochre robes, and went forth from the lay life to homelessness. Once I had gone forth, I set out to discover what is skillful, seeking the supreme state of sublime peace." So here the Buddha said, here it seems that the Buddha did not sneak out in the middle of the night. It seems that he actually discussed with his parents. So he knows that they wished otherwise. So clearly they had a conversation. And it seems that they were present when he shaved off his hair and beard and when he went forth, because they were there weeping with tearful faces. So clearly the family was present. And also Buddha mentions his mother and father. He does not mention anything about a wife. He doesn't mention anything about a son. So whether or not they existed is unclear, but clearly, I mean, the Buddha himself doesn't say that they exist, doesn't say anywhere that he was married in the early sources. And also there's an interesting little detail that he says mother and father. So according to tradition, we believe that his mother actually passed away 7 days after his birth, and that he was raised by his maternal aunt, Mahapajapati. But according to this sutta, he doesn't say, my stepmother and father wished otherwise. He just says that mother and father wished otherwise. So whatever that means is obviously open to interpretation. But in the early sources, we don't find the elaborate family background stories that we find in later tradition. So that much is found in the early sources. Of course, later literature was extremely fascinated with the Buddha's family and especially with his wife. And in later times, a lot of stories proliferated about the Buddha's wife. But originally, they weren't very cohesive. So there were lots of stories, and the Buddha's wife had lots and lots of different names. And only gradually over time, sort of everything coalesced towards using the name Yasodharā. But we have lots of stories where the Buddha's wife has actually different names. And I have copied a small passage here from Bhante Sujato's book, White Bones, Red Rod, Black Snakes. So this is a modern book. This is not any kind of historical text of Buddhism, but I thought it was just such a beautiful and concise summary. So I just wanted to include that in the course and read it out briefly. And this shows us the variance of names that refer to the Buddha's wife. And Bhante Sujato says here, but who is she really? Her name is as various as that of the goddess herself. She is Yasodharā or Yasovati or Bhattacachana or Bhattakacha or Subhadaka or Bada. Perhaps Bimbi Deva or Bimba Sundari or just plain Bimba or else Gopa or Gopika, unless it was Mrgaja or Mrgarajanya. So all these are names we find in tradition that refer to the Buddha's wife. So we see, obviously, yeah, it's not very likely that an actual historical wife of the Buddha would have that many names. And then also her family is like a little bit a similar situation. Her father was Dandapani or Mahanama or Amitodana or Sukkodana or Suppabuddha or Kinkinishvara. And her mother was Pamita or Amita or perhaps Godi, and her brothers may have been Ananda or Devadatta. So Yasodharā, as I said, is a very mysterious figure. And only later tradition became very fascinated with it. And then we had a lot of stories about her. And one of the stories we are now going to read together is her story in the Pali Apadāna. And her Apadāna is number 28. And her Apadāna is, compared to other Apadānas, her Apadāna is very interesting. We have read quite a few Apadānas or excerpts from Apadānas in our course. And when we compare Apadāna literature with earlier literature, it is sort of noteworthy that Apadānas are a lot more colorful or a lot more magical. It all seems a little bit exaggerated. There are lots of magical powers on display, and some of the numbers seem quite exaggerated. For example, Mahapajapati, who has a following of 500 nuns. So 500 obviously seems like a very big number. But still, all these Apadānas we have read so far had some sort of grounding in reality. Like, for example, according to Buddhist thought, if you develop your mind, it's not inconceivable that you can attain all these psychic powers and that this is actually possible. Like in the thought world of Buddhist development on the path, it's actually, you know, these are actually possible. It seems very colorful, it seems very magical, but it is somehow still grounded in reality. Yasodhara's Apadāna is different. Yasodhara's Apadāna is really exaggerated to a point where it is no longer even conceivable that this could be real. Like Yasodharā, for example, says she has a following of like hundreds of thousands of people. Other nuns, hundreds of thousands of nuns. So that's not a realistic number. And then some of the things that are told in her Apadāna also seem very fantastical. So we see that Apadāna is still much later than all the other Apadānas we've read so far. And her story completely dwarfs, for example, Mahapajapati's story, which is also supposed to be very magical and very inspiring. And Mahapajapati's following of 500 nuns is supposed to be supposed to show us that she's a great leader with a huge support base. But that's totally dwarfed by Yasodharā with her hundreds of thousands of followers. And so obviously Yasodhara's story must have come into being still much later than other apadāna literature. And so after Yasodhara's apadāna number 28, there is number 29, which is a story about 10,000 nuns who are all following Yasodharā. And then apadāna 30 is again 18,000 nuns who are all followers of Yasodharā. And their stories are equally magical and fantastical. So a lot of apadānas sort of developed around Yasodharā, all seemingly around the same sort of later point in time. And I think now we just start reading the apadāna and then you will see what I'm talking about. And Yasodhara's apadāna is very, very long. So we're going to skip lots of passages because we just simply don't have the time to go through everything. But I think you still get a very good impression of what kind of genre this text is and what kind of stories are being told here in this version. And the story begins. At one time, the leader of men, so the Buddha, was staying in a mountain cave in the city Rajagaha, which was lovely and prosperous. This is what was reasoned out then by the nun named Yasodharā, who was dwelling in that city, inside a lovely convent there. Nanda, Rahula, and Bhaddha, likewise the two chief followers, so this is Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, Suddhodana Maharaja, this is the Buddha's father, and Gotami Pajapati, so this is obviously Mahapajapati, the great Theras of great renown and the Therīs with great powers, they've gone to peaceful nirvana, traceless like the flame of a lamp. So obviously this story is set towards the very, very end of the Buddha's life. We know that Sariputta and Mahamoggallana passed away just before the Buddha passed. And we have seen in Mahapajapati's apadāna story that she also decided to pass into parinibbana just before the Buddha passed. And she passed with her large following of nuns, with all the 500 nuns, and together with Khema and Khema's following. And we see even Rahula seems to have passed away before the Buddha. So this must be like in the last few days of the Buddha's life, this apadāna story here. So Yasodharā continues, while the world's Lord still is living, I'll travel that peaceful path too. And having reasoned all that out, she foresaw the end of her life. Foreseeing that life's aggregates would be destroyed that very day, she set out from her own ashram, carrying her robe and her bowl. So we see her story sort of mimics Mahapajapati's story, where Mahapajapati also decides to pass away just before the Buddha. And we will see more parallels between her and Mahapajapati in a bit. So honored by 100,000 nuns, the nun named Yasodharā, greatly powerful, greatly wise, then went up to the Sambuddha. So here is one of the examples that I talked about. She has a following of 100,000 nuns. So obviously this is there to show how successful she was, what a great leader she is. And so the story here is written by somebody who had great respect for Yasodharā and who really wanted to portray her in a very beautiful light as somebody with authority, a strong leader, a strong woman. And then she goes to the Buddha, and then the story continues. Having worshipped the Sambuddha at the wheel-marked soles of his feet, sitting off to one side of him, she spoke these words to the teacher. I'm 78 years old now. The last of old age has arrived. I'm reporting to the great sage. I've attained sainthood in a cave. So she's an arahant. Old age has ripened for me now. Verily, my life's a trifle. Giving all you up, I will go my refuge is made in myself. So again, I think this is a very beautiful line here that I have highlighted. My refuge is made in myself. So again, she's shown as a very strong, independent woman. She doesn't have the usual attributes that are often associated with women. She's very attached to her family or anything. But she says, I've given all you up. I'm independent. I've attained awakening. I've let go of all the fetters, and I've made my refuge in myself. So I think very beautiful passage here, again showing her as a very strong, independent person. And she says, in the final days of old age, death breaks the body into bits. Today at nighttime, great hero, I shall achieve my nirvana, where there's no birth, no growing old, nor sickness and death, great sage. I'm going to the great city, which unconditioned has no death. Through this vast multitude here, all these revering the teacher, know that every imperfection is forgiven, face to face, sage. So here she literally goes up to the Buddha and she says to the Buddha, I forgive all your imperfections, Buddha. So this is a complete twist of how we would usually think the situation should be, where we are the imperfect ones and we have to ask the Buddha for forgiveness. But she here is basically shown as his equal, as a real companion to him. And she is the one who is forgiving his imperfections first. And then in the next stanza, she's also asking for forgiveness from him. But first of all, she tells him, I forgive all your flaws, Buddha. So that's quite an unusual way of telling the story. And I think this is really to show that she is the Buddha's true companion, basically on an equal level almost. And she says, transmigrating in existence, if I have ever disturbed you, I'm announcing it, great hero, please forgive my imperfection. So she's also asking for forgiveness. And obviously this is a ceremony that is still very much practiced in Buddhist circles up until nowadays. So something that seems to go back for a very long time, this asking for forgiveness before we part ways, so that if anything has come up and something, you know, anger might arise in somebody and we don't even know it, that we have provoked them. So to make sure that when we part ways, we are parting in a good way, without any tension between us. This forgiveness ceremony is something that is still very much practiced in monastic circles. And then the Buddha says, after hearing that speech of hers, the Lord of Sages then said this, what better can I say to you when you're going to nirvana? Now display your superpowers, doer of my dispensation, let doubt in the dispensation be cut off for all assemblies. So the Buddha is asking her now to perform some miracles, some superpowers. And here he is giving the reason that he wants her to remove the doubt from the people, doubt in the teaching from people. And this again mirrors very closely Mahapajapati's story, where she also displays all the superpowers before passing into Nibbana. And here the reason is given to remove doubt in the dispensation. But in many of the other stories where the Buddha asks the women to perform superpowers, one other reason why he asks them to do this is to remove doubt from people about the abilities of women specifically. So to show that women are entirely as capable as men to attain all the higher stages of the path and to attain all the superpowers and so on. The Buddha specifically asks women to show that to people, to remove this misperception in the abilities of women. So it's not mentioned directly here in this story, but it's mentioned in many other stories. So I guess specifically seeing a woman display all these abilities gives other women a boost in confidence, other people and especially other women a boost in confidence in their abilities. And then, having heard the words of the sage, the Buddhist nun Yasodharā, worshipping the king of sages, then spoke this speech to the Buddha. I am Yasodharā hero. In the home I was your chief queen, born in the clan of the Sakyas, established among women. In your household, O hero, I was the leader, the lord of all of the women there, who numbered 100,096. So here in this story, Yasodharā isn't just the Buddha's only wife. She's the chief queen, but the Buddha had many wives. Apparently, he had more than 100,000 wives. So obviously, this is again an exaggeration. Ancient India wasn't that densely populated, and it's not realistic to think that any city, even the big cities, could have supported that many nuns or that many women. And especially all those women then went forth with Yasodharā, so they would have to be supported as nuns by a community, which is not physically possible. But of course, this again shows her, these numbers are there again to show her leadership skills and her authority, and yeah, shown as a person who's somewhat equal in some respects to the Buddha, who's also a very great leader. And then here now there are many descriptions of the beauty of and the good qualities of those women. So we're skipping that a little bit because of time constraints. And then she starts to display all kinds of superpowers. We're also skipping the superpowers. And she is doing various transformations and all sorts of other miracles. But there are two transformations that I found especially remarkable, and that is she transforms herself into Sakra. Sakra is Sanskrit, in Pali called Saka, the king of gods, and also Brahma, the king of the gods in the fine material realm. And this, of course, is especially noteworthy. I think this is a direct reference to a passage that appears quite frequently in the suttas, which has been shown to be a later insertion by lots of research, by lots of scholars. So I think this is not a debated point. And there is that passage in the suttas, which the later passage says that women are incapable of doing 5 things. They cannot become Saka, God, the king of gods. They cannot become Mara. They cannot become Brahma. And they cannot become a wheel-turning monarch, and they cannot become a Buddha. So I think here this is a direct reference to that later insertion. Maybe at this point that later insertion was already being debated. It's likely that people at all times must have questioned the legitimacy of that passage. And here Yasodharā is shown as a woman to assume the form of Saka and also the form of Brahma. And we have another apadānas type story, or commentarial type story of Upalavanna, who also had great psychic powers, where she transforms herself into a wheel-turning monarch. So this became then a popular motif in women's stories, where women do actually transform themselves into these beings in direct opposition to that passage in the suttas. And by doing this, obviously, they claim that this passage is wrong, and sort of reclaim the abilities of women to become those 5 things, including becoming a Buddha, a female Buddha. And then she continues talking about her attainments. And these are kind of stock passages. They also recur in other apadāna literature. And then she continues talking here. My meeting with all the Buddhas, the world lords, was well seen by you. My extensive service to them was for the sake of you, great sage. O sage, recall the good karma which formerly was done by me, that merit was heaped up by me for the sake of you, great hero. So here now, she's referring to her meeting a lot of Buddhas. So later in her apadāna, we will see that she claims that she met millions and millions of Buddhas. That also, I'll talk more about this when we come to it, but that also seems like a very much later tradition. according to the standard Theravada way of thinking, Yasodharā and the Buddha came together as a couple. Their sort of fate was interlinked, and the Buddha Dipankara. And Dipankara Buddha is the Buddha 24 Buddhas before Gautama Buddha. And that was so many eons and so many incalculable eons, a very long time ago. So that the 24th Buddha before Gautama Buddha. And he made the prediction of the future Buddhahood of Gautama Buddha, and for Yasodharā, he made a prediction for her to being the future wife of the Buddha. And then after that, they had many, many rebirths together to accumulate the good karma to actually become Buddha and Buddha's wife. But technically, because there were only 24 Buddhas in between, she can only have met 24 Buddhas in that time frame, according to traditional Theravada thinking. So this might be a reference to those 24. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes when we come to the other stanza. But here, what is remarkable here is that she is calling the Buddha to witness all the good karma that she has made. So she is the active one here, the one making the karma, and the Buddha is simply witnessing that. And this is remarkable. I hope you can remember this for next time when we talk about Bhatta Kapilani, who is Mahakassapa's wife. And so this is very interesting to compare Buddha and Buddha's wife and Mahakassapa's wife. And especially because Mahakassapa kind of takes on a role as sort of an informal successor of the Buddha. So as he sort of informally takes on leadership in the Sangha after the Buddha's passing. He's the one who convenes the first council. He's the one who presides over the first council. So one would think that his wife, Bhatta Kapilani, would develop in, the stories around her would develop in a somewhat similar way to Yasodharā. But when we look at her next week, we see that it's actually quite significantly different. So the remarkable thing about this passage will actually become clear next week when we read about Bhatta Kapilani. But here it's just remarkable that she is the active one, the one making the marriage, and the Buddha is the one who is witnessing that. And then she talks about all the good things that she has done, and how like consistently she practiced that for billions, tens of billions of times. So again, we see these really, really large numbers. And made an amazing, extreme amount of good karma. And then we're going to skip all the things that she actually gave up. And she performed a lot of service and so on. And here then she mentions how she and the Buddha met under Dipankara Buddha. How their story got how their fate got intertwined there. I've left all this out. This is very, very long. So I have skipped all that. And after they met in Dipankara Buddha's time, then they were reborn together for a long time. And at last, she's telling about her last life here. And she says, undergoing pleasure and pain among gods and human beings. When my last rebirth was attained, I was born in the Sakyan clan, beautiful and very wealthy, famous and likewise virtuous, endowed with every attainment. I am much honored among the clans. Riches, fame, hospitality, and indulgence in worldly things, they do not agitate my mind. I have no fear from anything. And I was appointed to attend on what the Blessed One had said with the harem of the king in the Kshatriyan city. Then I'm a woman who is a servant and one who feels pleasure and pain, a woman who declares the facts, a woman who is compassionate. So again, she's celebrating her own attainments. And now she states, Buddhas numbering 5 billion and another 9 billion more. I provided vast alms to them. Those Buddhas, gods over the gods. So these are obviously extreme numbers. sort of rare to find in Theravada tradition. This is more something that we find in Mahayana. But as we know, this apadāna is very late. So this might be a Mahayana influence here, where of course it's very common to have all these crowds of Buddhas flock together from different universes and all converge. So here again, she's celebrating all the merit that she's making, but her story becomes more and more fantastical. This is something we haven't seen in any of the other apadānas so far. And now there are many, many stanzas where she just celebrates all the massive amounts of Buddhas that she has served. So there are over and over and over more and more Buddhas that she's serving. So yeah, we'll skip all that because I'm a little bit conscious of time. And then finally she says, disgusted with transmigration, I went forth into homelessness, surrounded by thousands of nuns after renouncing with nothing. So here again, we see her own spiritual attainments. She had a very, very genuine spiritual vocation of her own. She didn't go forth because the Buddha made her to, like in the story with the Buddha's brother, where the Buddha sort of forced the brother to go forth, even though the brother wanted to get married. And she didn't go forth because she was bored alone, like the story of the Buddha's sister, who missed all her family, who had all gone forth. So she went forth to be with the family. But Yasodharā actually is shown to have a very genuine spiritual vocation. She is disgusted with transmigration, and therefore she goes forth. She doesn't go forth because she misses her husband. So again, we see a very strong, independent woman, a worthy companion of the Buddha. And now there are a few stock passages, and then this is the end of the apadāna. So in this apadāna, I think what we can see is that this story was written really to celebrate women's accomplishments and to really make it clear what women's abilities are, and that they're in no way inferior to the male abilities. And so this story is here to celebrate women in the sangha, to celebrate bhikkhunīs. And I just find this so remarkable because in this course, in the last few sessions, we have seen quite a few texts that really seem to put women down, that really seem to be very misogynistic, very sexist, and very sort of discouraging for women. But the Buddhist tradition is not one monolithic block. First of all, the position of women sort of changed over the centuries, and we see that reflected in the texts that were created at different points in time. But also within the sangha, at any given moment in time, there wasn't, and even now there isn't, unanimous opinions about everything. So certainly at all times, there must have been people, monks and nuns, who were very supportive of female practice. And there must have been people who were sort of quite opposed and quite misogynistic. And all these tendencies is what we see reflected in the text. And that's sometimes that can seem very confusing because there isn't one clear line that always says women are such or women are such. But there are all these multiple voices that we find in the text. And we do have also these very beautiful texts, very encouraging texts for women. And now, as promised, we will move on to the Chinese Ekotthata Agama text about Bhattacacana. And this text was translated by Bhikkhu Analayo in an essay called Karma and Female Rebirth. And this is published and is freely available on the internet, easy to find if you want to Google it. And I'm now switching to the other document. And this Chinese sutta here, or this passage from a Chinese sutta, is part of a larger sutta. And Bhattacacana did not translate the entire sutta because it's very long. And anyway, we are just interested in the part about Vadakachana, so it's perfect for us that he didn't translate everything. And he left a brief introduction here, so a summary of the beginning of the discourse, which is not translated. And he writes, the tale of Vadakachana is part of a longer discourse. This discourse begins with King Pasenadi visiting the Buddha. After being taught the Dharma, Pasenadi invites the Buddha and the monastic community to rely on his support alone for a 3-month period, which the Buddha accepts. Pasenadi has a great hall erected where for 3 months he makes offerings of robes, food, bedding, and medicine. At the completion of this period, Pasenadi proclaims his satisfaction with the merit he has achieved in this way. In reply, the Buddha cautions him not to remain satisfied with the merit he has acquired and relates a story from one of his past lives by way of illustration. The narration of this Jataka, so Jataka means a past life story, concludes with the Buddha encouraging Pasenadi not to rest satisfied with the merits he has acquired, but to make use of them for the purpose of progress towards liberation. Pasenadi then apologizes for his earlier statement, which the Buddha readily accepts. So King Pasenadi makes a lot of merit in this story, and then he rejoices, and the Buddha tells him, basically there are 2 ways of using this merit. One is to just direct it towards a positive rebirth, a nice rebirth, which is a way of squandering those merits, because after that rebirth is over, you have nothing left. But if you direct it towards progress on the path, and you actually attain something on the path, then this is something you will not lose. So this is a good way of making use of those merits. And now at this point, the bhikkhuni Vadakachana gets up from her seat, pays respect to the Buddha, and repeats the injunction given by the Buddha to the king that he should seek to progress towards liberation, which she follows by relating her own past as an additional illustration. So here something remarkable happens. 2 of the most powerful men at that time are sitting there having a conversation among themselves, and suddenly being uninvited, or not being invited, I mean, this bhikkhuni gets up and barges in the middle of the conversation and starts in front of the Buddha, starts teaching her own, giving her own teaching. And nobody finds it in any way unusual, or nobody thinks, oh, this woman is really out of line. Everybody in this sutta, everybody thinks, oh, this is a completely normal way of acting. So this is really, again, very, very empowering to the women, to Vadakachana. And then now here starts the translation of the sutta. And Vadakachana says, I recollect that 31 eons ago, the Therīgāthā Sikkin, an arahant fully awakened, had appeared in the world. He was accomplished in knowledge and conduct, a well-gone one, a knower of the world, an unsurpassable person, a charioteer of the path of Dharma, a teacher of devas and humans, called a Buddha, a blessed one. So those of us familiar with the Pali tradition will recognize this epithet. It's very similar to the Itipiso in Pali. So this is obviously a parallel passage to the Pali Itipiso chanting. And this Buddha Sikkin was wandering in the Marichi region. At that time, when the time had come to beg for alms food, that Buddha put on his robes, took his bowl, and entered the town of Marichi. At this time, there was a messenger in the town called Suddakalaka. That messenger then saw that the Tathagata was carrying his bowl and had entered the town to beg for alms food. Having seen him, he thought, the Tathagata has now entered the town. He must need food. He promptly entered his house and came out with food to give to the Tathagata, generating this aspiration. Endowed with this merit, may I not fall into the 3 evil destinies. May I in a future life meet a venerable noble one like him. May that venerable noble one teach me the Dharma, and may I then attain liberation. So it's somewhat parallel to what Pasenadi has done, offering things to a Buddha And that's what Bhattacharya is getting at here. And then she continues, Blessed One and King Pasenadi, may you both know this. Was the messenger Sutta at that time someone else? It should not be seen in this way. The reason is that the messenger Sutta at that time was me. At that time, I fed the Tathagata's skin and I made this aspiration. May I in a future life meet a venerable noble one like this, who will teach me the Dharma, and may I then attain liberation. For 31 eons, I did not fall into the 3 evil destinies. I was born among devas and human beings until at last I have now received this particular body. I met the Blessed One and gained the going forth to train in the path. I have eradicated all the influxes and accomplished arahantship. So now there are 2 very remarkable points in this story so far. And one is that Bhattacharya here in this past life was a male person, a male messenger, and she gave food to this Buddha and then made this aspiration, may the merit that I gained from this be directed towards my future meeting of a Buddha and my future path towards arahantship. And that actually comes to fruition. The merit bears fruit, and she does come into contact with a Buddha and attain arahantship, but her body transforms into a female body. In this life, obviously, she is a bhikkhunī. And that is celebrated as something extremely meritorious. The whole story is just to show how meritorious it is, how much of a blessing it is to direct your merits in this way. And in no way is there even a hint or even a trace of the idea that it is unfortunate to have a female body. On the contrary, this is the fruition of her meritorious action. So I think that is quite remarkable. And the other thing also is that, as we have seen in the Pali version, the Buddha and his wife's story became interlinked. Their karma became interlinked, their fate became interlinked in Dipankara Buddha's time. And after that, they had many rebirths together. And obviously, Buddha had a male rebirth, and Yasodharā had a female rebirth. But here, in this case, Bhattacharya has a male rebirth in the time of Sikhi Buddha. So Sikhi Buddha is well in between Dipankara Buddha and Gautama Buddha. That's not outside that time span. That's really actually not that far back from Gautama Buddha. So at that point, if Yasodharā was the Buddha's wife, then she should have had a female rebirth, not a male rebirth. So here in this story, in the Kottara Agama, we don't actually get the impression that Bhattacharya is conceptualized as the Buddha's wife. She's just any bhikkhunī. So whether or not Bhattacharya and Yasodharā should actually be identified as the same person is a little bit up to debate. If Bhattacharya and Yasodharā are not the same person, however, then Yasodharā does not appear in any of the early sources, because only Bhattacharya is in the list of foremost nuns. So then really there is no trace of Yasodharā in any of the early sources. And anyway, the story continues. As the Blessed One said so superbly and sublimely in speaking to King Pasenadi, let all the various activities performed by body, speech, and mind be completely for seeking liberation. Do not consume these meritorious deeds on life in samsara. If I see bhikkhus, bhikkhunīs, male lay followers and female lay followers with their hearts delighting in the Tathagata, the thought arises in me, do not all these distinguished beings still need to have a mind of loving regard and reverence towards the Tathagata? If I see the 4 assemblies, I approach them and say, virtuous ones, what things do you require? Robes and bowls, sitting cloths, needle cases, bathing vessels, any other sundry requisites of recluses, I will supply them all. Being permitted to do so, I seek for them by begging anywhere. If I get them, that is a great fortune. If I do not get them, then I will go to Uttarakuru, Aparagoyana, and pubavideha, seeking an offering. The reason is that through all this, the 4 assemblies will gain the path to nirvana. So here again, Bhattakachana is displayed as a leadership figure in the sangha. She's taking care of the others. She's providing all the things that they need. So she must feel a sense of responsibility towards the others. And is again shown as a very capable woman, as a very capable bhikkhuni here. At that time, the Blessed One, examining the mind of the bhikkhuni Bhattakachana, said to the bhikkhus, "Have you seen such liberation of the mind by faith as in the bhikkhuni Bhattakachana?" The bhikkhus replied, "We have not seen it, Blessed One." The Blessed One said, "Among my disciples, the bhikkhuni Bhattakachana is the bhikkhuni who is foremost in having attained liberation by faith." At that time, the bhikkhuni Bhattakachana, King Pasenadi, and the 4 assemblies, having heard what the Buddha said, were delighted and received it respectfully. So this is the end of this Chinese sutta in the Ekattara Agama. And I think I should slowly, or maybe quickly, come to the end of today's session. So just to conclude, what we have seen today is the Buddhist tradition really celebrating women's accomplishments, a tradition that is very, very supportive of female practice, that depicts strong, independent female leaders, very accomplished women. And again, this shows us that Buddhist tradition is not one monolithic block, and that there is a multi-vocality of voices, and that at all times, just as now, there were strong supporters of bhikkhunīs among the obvious opposition that was also there. But in texts like these ones, we really see how they celebrate women and women's accomplishments. So with this, I'm going to end for today. And now, if you have any questions or comments, I will try my best to see if I can answer them. So are there any questions or comments? Yes, Anna-Marie?
Thank you. So with regards to the changing attitudes towards women moving with the times, is it possible to say certain times, like 500 BC, so and so, that were more in favor, like in general, in the wider culture, that were more in favor, that we can also see in the text? Like, is it possible to see these texts are from that period and they all seem to be more in favor or more positive towards women?
So it's not that easy to date the text. Obviously, in the very early tradition, the tradition of the Buddha's own time, seems to be much in favor, and that we can date basically to the Buddha's time. But still, there is a debate when the Buddha actually lived. So, but during the Buddha's own time, it seems the situation was quite supportive for bhikkhunīs. After that, we see that there was a very strong change very quickly after the Buddha's passing. So in the story of the first council that we've seen, which probably was written down roughly 100 years after the Buddha, during the second council, we see a dramatic change in the attitude towards women. And also in the Vinaya literature that seems to have developed in let's say, a few centuries after the Buddha's time, we see very critical attitudes towards women somewhat emerging there. It's not that easy to date the apadāna literature, and the apadāna literature evolved over many, many centuries. But it seems that with the emergence of Mahayana, Mahayana was a counter movement to that movement that happened after the Buddha's passing. So after the Buddha's passing, the Sangha became not only more misogynistic or more sexist, but the Sangha also became a lot more ascetic. there was a lot more emphasis on reclusive practice alone in the forest. So the lone sage in the forest became a role model as opposed to community practice. And then Mahayana started, so to speak, as a counter movement with more emphasis on compassion and on connection with the people. And that also then brought changing attitudes towards women. But Mahayana also developed over many, many, many centuries. So it's not that easy to actually put figures on the apadāna literature, especially because in Yasodhara's case, the apadāna seems to be much later than all the rest of the apadāna. But I think also maybe I can ask Vanessa to say a little bit about this, because Vanessa actually, she is an expert on Yasodharā. She has written a book on Yasodharā, so I'm actually not at all confident to speak in front of her about Yasodharā. So I think maybe you can say a few words, Vanessa, if you wouldn't mind.
Are you? I think you did such a beautiful job. It was so nice to read the apadāna with you like that. I have no critiques whatsoever, and I think you raised some really good points. I didn't know about that Analayo article, so I wrote that down. So I'm very grateful for that. In terms of you're asking a question about Anne-Marie, about like when it switched over, or when things got more patriarchal. Is that what you're wondering?
Yeah, like how easy, if it is at all possible to date these texts and to see at what times it was a bit more like this and what times it was a bit more like that.
It's really hard. There's also the scholarship has slowed down on that front. So it was a very popular thing to kind of wrestle with early on in the 19th century. Then there was a wave of it again in the 80s and 90s. So the scholarship goes through waves where it really wants to tackle those kinds of questions, and then it stops and other things become interesting and we're not. So right now we're not really getting a lot of new scholarship helping us date a lot of this material. We're not seeing many new translations. So the Walters translation of the Apadāna is a new translation, but there are very few of them being done right now. So we don't have really new discussion. What we have is roundabout dates. Everything is kind of, well, we're dating. So we're looking at some of our earliest literature might be about, maybe it depends when you date the Buddha also. And we don't agree as to when he lived. And then once we agree as to when he lived, if he lived, which that's also a debate, then when were the first texts? And then which ones were the first texts? And we're looking at maybe 400 years after he lived that we start seeing the first text go into writing, but then we don't even have manuscripts in some cases for 1800 years after that, right? Some of our earliest manuscripts, other than like our Kharoshthi fragments and our Gandharan fragments, are from the 18th century and the 19th century, because a lot of the manuscripts that were written, they were written on very brittle materials that didn't last. Right? They weren't writing on leather the way biblical manuscripts were. So we don't have really old manuscripts except for little bits and pieces. So everything's kind of guesswork and kind of scratching your head going, well, this might, but the broken telephone situation is really intense. So if the Buddha lived, let's say 500 BC, and then let's say the first fragments of writing happens 300 or 400 years after that, then our first manuscripts are 2000 years later. It's crazy. The space we have between what he might have said if he existed and what we have written, right? So that's where oral tradition becomes really important, but then oral tradition can't be tracked in a very serious way. So it's a lot of guesswork. We don't have any confirmations of anything. And when people want to have confirmations, it's a kind of insecurity of saying, no, I'm right, and this is how it goes. So what Venerable is doing in this course is really trying to figure out the layers of like, well, did this come before? And she's almost like creating like a Sherlock Holmes of the puzzles of all these texts, and she does it brilliantly. But she's right. I think she's right all the time. But we don't actually know. We're just trying to figure it out, So we hope the Buddha was as inclusive as we're imagining. We hope he existed. We hope he wouldn't have supported things like the Garudharmas and some of the decisions that were made later. We don't know. We don't know anything, and that's hard. So that's also something to, I think, keep in mind as we go forward with this stuff, is to try to figure out which part is a projection of my hopes and needs of what Buddhism should be, and who he was, if he existed, you have to like keep this humility and not get to that certainty. That certainty will kill you. You know, it's really kind of bad for your thinking, I think. It's hard.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate your input. And I agree, it's a lot, like it's kind of a lot of guesswork, and then we can make educated guesses if we read a lot of material, and we can also rely on judgment of other people, and we can like see developments in the text, like which text must be earlier, which text must be later, but still we can't really put a number, like a date. We can only say this one is earlier than the other one, but we can't really say anything with absolute certainty.
And those things of seeing who's earlier and who's later, you really can do, right? Some of these texts quote previous texts. So we do get a roadmap in the text of how they're building and how they're quoting each other and how they're using each other, but we just don't know where the start point is. And we don't know, we don't know. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. So it's really important. I think I see this a lot in sangha groups, is this kind of certainty that comes out. It gets very zealous of this is who the Buddha was. This is what he would have wanted. This is how he felt about these things. All of that stuff is really dangerous terrain, you know? So I just think we have to stay humble all the time. I don't know. I want to believe the Buddha was not a misogynist. I desperately would like to believe that if he had insights, he would not have seen all women as being some kind of polluted, destructive force. I really need to believe that, but I don't know. I don't know what he would have said. It's hard.
Tracy, did you just raise your hand or were you just waving? Okay, please go ahead.
Waving and raising, yeah. Thank you, thanks Vanessa, and thank you, Aya. I really appreciate the session today. I think that it's actually just like really helpful to hear any stories about like kind of civic leadership by women in the like early texts, because I think you know, even though like there's a jumble of like dates and sources, I think some stories have been told more often than others, at least like in my experience. And so I think that the stories of like women in domestic roles are like extremely powerful and moving. And I think it's also like really healing and helpful to hear about women in leadership roles. So I like, you know, I just love hearing, you know, having that centered and retold, and look forward to hearing more of those types of stories. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for this session.
Okay, I'm glad you appreciate it. I also liked this session. Actually, I didn't expect to like the session so much because I used to have a very difficult relationship with Yasodharā. I somehow couldn't emotionally really connect with her. But when I prepared for this session, somehow I felt it was a lot more inspiring than I had expected it to be. So yeah. I actually also think this is probably one of my more favorite sessions.
Can I ask you a question, Venerable?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you have a difficulty with Yasodharā? What's the obstacle?
Well, first of all, she doesn't appear in the early sources. So for me, there's a question mark there. Did she really exist? Is this just like a figment of, you know, like, is this just a delusion that we are all following? And I'm kind of a truth seeker. So I'm in Buddhism because I really want to understand the truth about reality and the truth about, you know, my own mind. So, you know, connecting very strongly with a story that is delusional seemed like there was just a barrier in my heart to somehow connect with her. But even if the story is not true in the historical sense, it's a story about a powerful woman. And I mean, the storytelling has, I mean, probably the stories weren't made to be historically truthful. They were made to be inspiring. And they were made to tell stories that maybe could have been, or that people thought that were possible. So at some point I came to realize that maybe it's not all that necessary for the story to be historically truthful to still have a valuable contribution. So then I gave up my internal resistance a little bit.
But what about, so if you're going to argue history, I mean, I don't know about the history of any of this, to be honest. But if we're arguing historical value, she's all over the Jatakas. And some of those are extremely early. And then you have her in Buddhaghosa's, the Buddhacharita, Ashvaghosha, sorry, Ashvaghosha's Buddhacharita. And that's 1st or 2nd century. So that competes with some of the earliest suttas we have. So even if she's not in the Pali sources, she's in the Pali Jatakas and she's in the Buddhacharita. And that's very, very early. So I don't know if your historical skepticism deserves, you know, like if she deserves to be that, like if you're going to be skeptical about her, then you have to be skeptical about everything else too. Because if she's in the Jatakas and she's in Ashvaghosha, she's equivalent to the other characters, no? I don't know why you would question her and not question, you know, Maya dying or whatever it is. I mean, I know we have the Acharya Buddha Sutta, which is very early, but so is Ashvaghosha. He's very early. No?
So I also question Maya dying. So I also have a question mark
Okay,
around Maya. So yeah, I think again, this comes to what you just mentioned. There is so much debate about what is early and what is not early. And I guess some of my teachers just don't really consider the Jatakas early. Like the Jatakas are Indian folk tales, and many of them predate the Buddha.
Yeah.
But then the connection between the story itself and how they are linked to the rebirths of people seem to have often been added later. So the story was there, but the connection to actual like Buddhist personalities seems to have been added later in many cases.
But what about Visantara? There's like Visantara reliefs everywhere, right? Don't we have that in Barhut and Sanchi?
Yeah, but again, these are centuries after the Buddha, whereas many people have faith in that the Nikaya texts actually go back to the Buddha, to the 5th century. So that makes them a few centuries earlier.
But based on what? How would we decide that the Majjhima Nikaya goes all the way back to the Buddha? That's your broken telephone argument.
Well, based on textual, like internal consistency, I think. So it seems that those texts must have been earlier than some of the other texts, because the other texts sort of rely on the earlier texts existing. But as you mentioned, you know, it's difficult. We have in that case, we have to have faith in the oral tradition.
Right.
And for us modern people, that's very hard to have, because we have so scattered memories. Our memories are so scattered that we can't even like remember 5 minutes after what we just heard. So it's inconceivable for us how these large amounts of text could have preserved over many centuries. And I think other scholars, for example, Analayo, have made these arguments how Indian traditions had all these techniques that show us how they could actually preserve this, and how also the Brahminical tradition has preserved the Vedas for centuries before the Buddha already. And they have like the early texts, they have all these rhetorical features that make memorization much easier, like all the repetitions, all the synonyms, and also the stock passages that occur in many of the suttas. And these are all features of an oral tradition. So these are texts that must have originated in an oral culture, whereas many of the sort of little bit later texts don't have those features. So they would have to have originated in a culture that started to use writing more. So all these features that enable memorization wouldn't have been so necessary. And so when texts don't have many repetitions, then that shows us that this must have come into existence at a time when writing was popular. Whereas if the texts have a lot of repetitions, that seems to indicate that this must have been from a time when people either memorized the text or when they had just switched to writing. So they were still using the earlier tradition because that is what they were used to. But with the new medium, they didn't actually need to. And then slowly they sort of left that out.
I can see that argument. I'll make you one counter argument because I'm so attached to Yasodharā. I want to defend her. Okay, so my only counter argument to that is that I agree that the memorization techniques are there and that most ancient cultures were able to memorize things in ways that we cannot imagine because we're so reliant on writing things down. So we don't know how to use our memories the way probably ancient communities did. I will grant you an unallow that. But my guess is that remembering philosophical texts, it's much easier to make mistakes and find points of philosophical arguments. And what people can remember and enjoy and extrapolate and develop and change is stories. I think the one thing that we can guarantee probably was told and retold and retold and changed and changed and changed is the stories. And so even if Yasodharā wasn't written by some of the early council members or whatever else, because why would they want to remember her? Because she's a wife and nobody wants her. That story makes, like, people would have told the story of the Buddha and the wife and the son and the drama. People love stories. Philosophy, you know, the fine points of how your mind gets attached and doesn't get attached, and the eye seeing, and then, you know, getting attached to the object, and then like, this is crazy stuff to have to remember. But you'll remember a good story.
Sure, but I think the early people must have thought that the Buddha's teaching was probably more important than, you know, his family background, because the teaching is what, you know, brings you to liberation, not the story about Yasodharā.
But how many people would have been able to do that?
I think there was a really big effort in the early sangha to actually memorize that and to preserve that. And that's why communal recitation is so important, because
Right.
if one person recites, it's very easy to make mistakes. But if you recite in a group and one person makes a mistake, that's immediately obvious.
That's true.
Yeah, so but it's very well possible that, I mean, Yasodhara's story was there, but it wasn't fixed in the same way that the suttas were fixed. Like the suttas, they were trying to really keep this like verbatim, like every single word in the same way, so that they could recite in a group. But the storytelling tradition, this is like one person telling a story, and you don't have to memorize that to the same extent. And I think that developed over the centuries, and we can see how it developed.
Yeah.
We have so many stories, you know, from different like points in time, and we see how the story evolved over time. Even last time when we talked about the Seven Sisters, we saw how the story sort of got expanded, and they added prequels and they added sequels, and even the core story about the Seven Sisters who then became ascetics changed over time and got expanded over time. So I think there was a really clear distinction between those doctrinal texts that they really tried to preserve like perfectly, and the stories that they were sort of more flexible with.
No, that I think for sure. I think that would be, I don't think there's any need for the stories to be fixed. And I think we have so much evidence that people allowed themselves to play with the stories and to tell it in their own way. And that's why all these characters keep evolving. And I think that's really important to the tradition, is that the stories keep changing. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. But I think the stories probably were always there. I don't know. I wonder if there's a discomfort with the idea of the Buddha having a family, having a wife and a child. And so that's why that story keeps getting put to the side. And his mother, it's very much like Christianity. The mother takes front and center, and anyone who's intimate with him goes in the background. So that's why I think I'm defending these characters. I'm like, no, I think we're just putting them away because we don't want them there.
For sure. I mean, the story is kind of very controversial because the Buddha also abandoned the wife and the child. So that seems like a very cruel thing to do.
And we don't want to deal with that.
Yeah, for somebody who is so compassionate, or supposed to be so compassionate.
That's what I think is the problem.
For Tracy? Sure. The other thing is, the only thing is that I think there is a really large multivocality around like the Buddha's wife, and she has so many names and there's so many stories. So I really think that in the beginning the character wasn't that well defined, and the story sort of started to coalesce at some point at a later time.
But they all agree he left her, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And he left her as she gives birth. That story keeps coming back. So you can't get away from the thorn in the story, right? Like we have a problematic Buddha here.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So yeah, all I'm saying is we don't know.
Yeah, no, we don't. Tracy keeps trying to jump in as we debate.
Yeah,
this.
Tracy.
I feel like we could debate this for 2 hours.
I know we're going over time. I just want to like raise the question of like, certainly it's problematic for the Buddha to have left a wife and a child. I think it's also problematic, like for the Buddhists, like for the original Buddhist community to be one where like women monastics and women lay women had as much of a voice and agency in the sangha as male leaders and the Buddha. So I think that like, so for me, like hearing the types of stories that we had today about like women speaking up in assembly and being like, and that not being odd at all, I think are really, my question is like, which stories is the tradition more uncomfortable with, and which ones need to be retold at this moment in time? So that's sort of like the question I find interesting now.
Tracy, there's an amazing, sorry, I just have to, okay, and I have to go have a dentist appointment, but there's this amazing passage. There's another Sanskrit text called the Lalita Vistara. It's not part of the Theravada tradition. It's an amazing text. We only have parts of it in Sanskrit. It was translated into Tibetan, and we have a more full expansion of the text in the Tibetan version. And those have been translated into English, and you can find them online. There's a passage in the Lalita Vistara after they get married. See, I'm such a defender of Yasodharā. But it's also, I'm projecting that I'm married and I have an only son. So I'm just projecting all of this on the story. I'll just put that out there. But where the Buddha's parents, the prince, right? So it's Suddhodana and Gautami, they ask her, you have to veil yourself. You can't go as the wife of the prince. You have to wear a veil. And women in this story, in this context, don't show their faces. And she refuses. And she gives a teaching to the entire court in front of her husband, to his parents and the court, of why she should show who she is. It is one of the most extraordinary passages of a woman's agency and a voice, where she makes the teaching. She challenges the court, the royal family, and her husband of why she should show her face and never hide herself. And in the end, they agree. It's an amazing little story. And so if you're looking for those kinds of moments, that's a good one. That's beautiful. Thank you for saying that. I also love just hearing where it's like normal for women to speak up in assembly. And like, that's what I thought was really interesting about the passage here. So it's like, it's not like a special thing that like a woman speaks up. It's actually just like part of the normal discourse. And I think that's really interesting if there is evidence of that. Thank you. Anyway, this is so interesting. Thank you, Aya. Thank you so much for making this space for us to have this conversation.
Yeah, I have to say, I really enjoyed the conversation today. So I'm very happy that we had the session today. Yeah, we have gone a little bit over time, and Vanessa has to go to her dentist appointment. So I think we're going to wrap up now. As usual, we will finish with 3 sadhus. Please join me if you'd like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.